Now, the Course Radio Network presents The Roy Green Show with Roy Green, keeping you informed and entertained. Now, here's Roy.
There's been a tremendous amount of debate about guns this week, and particularly after the shooting in Virginia with the two television station employees, the reporter and the photographer, being shot to death by a disgruntled former colleague, by an insane former colleague. So a lot of talk about guns, and then on Friday night, Texas deputy sheriff was shot to death after he'd filled up his cruiser. And the thinking is that he was shot because he was wearing the uniform. An individual has been arrested and charged. So a lot of talk about guns and about who should and who should not be allowed to have guns. We talked yesterday about whether or not kids should be allowed to have toy guns, and I told you that I got into some, later on I found out, sort of secondhand, that I got into some difficulty with some parents whose 8-year-old I gave a water squirter, a water soaker to, a multicolored water soaker to, because they didn't like the idea of my giving their kid a gun. It was a water pistol. And so we talked about that, and I read you the Atlantic article. If you go to my Twitter account, at The Roy Green Show, you'll find the link to the article in the Atlantic. And what the writer of the article pointed out was that toy guns are being written out of the history of our society. There's a toy museum, big one in the United States, and there are no Daisy BB guns in that entire museum, even though millions and millions of them were given to kids in the 1950s as toys. They don't exist in the entire museum. And the call's gone out for Daisy guns to be in the Toy Hall of Fame. But a lot of parents and teachers have argued against it, so that hasn't happened. Now, that's kids. And so we asked yesterday, and I'm not going there today, but we asked yesterday whether the introduction of toy guns to children would maybe lead to some strange pathological reality later on in life, with an overly unfocused fascination with firearms when you become an adult. Most people felt no. Most people felt, let kids have their toy guns. And the point I made was, you can give a kid a chicken finger, he'll point it at somebody, a boy. You give him a chicken finger, and eventually he'll point it at somebody and say bang, and that's what happened to little Billy Barnes of Nova Scotia. Pointed a chicken finger at a classmate, said bang, got suspended for 2 days. Another little kid brought a Lego toy gun to school, was interrogated, and I read this to you yesterday, was interrogated so strongly by the principal, the little guy wet his pants, scaring the little guy because he brought a Lego toy gun to school. So now we've been talking about this week about private ownership of firearms. It's been the discussion across North America, particularly in the United States, but Canada as well, about whether people should be allowed to have handguns, whether people should be allowed to have guns generally, whether it should still continue. And there are calls in the United States for, a restriction on firearm possession, and in this country as well. So I talked to Ed Burlew, who's perhaps Canada's #1 lawyer on gun-related criminal charges. And I wanted Ed to come on the show and talk about the law and firearms. And in this country, and he's here with me now on the phone. And Ed, we started talking about gun ownership, and you started to scare me. Because you pointed out situations I had no idea about, how legal Canadian gun owners can find themselves face to barrel with a weapon that's being wielded by an emergency task force or SWAT team, Canadian police officer, over something the gun owner said to someone else. Tell us what that's about, please, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me here today. This is something I've been facing, and my clients have been facing for 2 decades, and it's only getting more intense. What occurs is this. I'll give you one example. A very fine gentleman, retired from the Army, retired from police as well, was living in Toronto. His wife calls up. He's 82 years old, and she's advised by her doctor and his doctor that because he's having these little, what are called micro heart attacks, that she should call the ambulance, and they'll come quietly. And the doctor gives her the number. So she calls up the ambulance in Toronto, and she says, well, my husband's been having these micro heart attacks. We really need to take him over to the hospital. And so the operator says, well, tell me more about it. And, the woman, the wife is, wife for like 4 decades, maybe almost 5 decades, says, well, sometimes he figures life's not worth living. Well, the ambulance came, but was not allowed to come to the house because 3 SWAT teams were deployed. One went to the backyard, and their dog was there, and that officer threatened to shoot the dog unless the dog was controlled. There was another SWAT team at the house across the street. They closed down the intersection at this residential area of Toronto. And another SWAT team went into the house. They went upstairs and they saw the old gentleman who's sitting in his chair. Now, he has a difficulty walking. They pointed their full automatic rifles at him and they told him to get up and to march his rear end downstairs. And they marched him out. And only once he was out on the porch did they allow the ambulance to come up. And then they took every gun in the house. He had not threatened with a gun. All of his guns were safely stored. He owned a couple old rifles and his handguns that he'd had for 50 years. And that was pretty sad.
So his wife calls and says her husband is having micro heart attacks. Would you please send an ambulance? And they say they'll do it quietly. So now why did the police, he has guns, so how did the police become engaged? Why were the 3 SWAT teams dispatched? Did they find that he owned guns and that became the issue?
Yes. What happens is when you call for an ambulance or fire or police, it goes to the same type of operator, and they have what's called a 3-tiered response for ambulance, fire, and police. Same operator. And they punch up who you are, they punch up your address, and that connects to the Canadian Firearms system. And it says that you're a gun owner. And that's all it took. So
because he said, his wife said, he sometimes says he doesn't know if life is worth living. They made the leap to, he may use a gun to commit suicide. Is that it?
It seems that way. And it seems that way once I started talking with the Crown Attorney who talked to the police. That's the way it seemed.
82-year-old man.
Never did a violent thing. Absolutely perfect record. A very fine man, fine wife, good kids.
And he's taken.
He was taken to the hospital by the ambulance. But then the police continued, and they broke the closet. They took the guns out of the closet. They took he had his handguns in a safe. They took the safe, opened that later.
Ed, it's perfectly legal to own firearms if you do it legally, which this gentleman did. He didn't break any laws.
No, he didn't break any laws at all. This was an imaginary scenario that the operator and the police focused on. It didn't exist.
But it was not imaginary. It wasn't imaginary that 3 SWAT teams went to his house, shut down the intersection, and pointed automatic weapons at him while he sat in his chair, 82 years of age.
Yeah, he said, well, let the ambulance people come up here and help me out. Police wouldn't let that happen. They would not let the ambulance people in the house till they cleared the house, cleared him out of the house, and had taken possession of the house.
How do they justify this? How does the Crown justify it?
Well, they said we did it. That's all they said. We did it.
And so now you're dealing with the Crown, and were charges laid against this elderly gentleman?
Not at all.
Just his life was disrupted.
Oh, yeah. And at that point, he had his guns go to some of his family because he says, I can't stand this stress. He says, I call for an ambulance, and I get 3 SWAT teams?
You know, if you're 82 years of age and you're already suffering micro heart attacks, to suddenly have black-clad SWAT team police officers standing in front of you, pointing fully automatic weapons at you, that'd be enough to give you the heart attack that ends your life.
Well, that is always that risk. I had another. This is not an isolated example.
Hold on, Ed. Let me put you on hold. I have to take a break. We're going to come back with Ed Burlew. Here's some more of these incidents. I had no idea, none, zero, that this was going on in this country. None. This is not the United States. This happened in Toronto that Ed's telling us about. So there are other incidents, other situations. Legal gun owners who are not threatening anyone, not making any threats of any kind, and find themselves face to gun barrel with an emergency task force police officer or several of them. You're not doing anything to break the law. You own the guns completely legally, and yet here you are facing what that 82-year-old man faced. We'll come back with more from Ed Burlew, and then I'll have a question for you. Stay with us.
Informative and entertaining. This is The Roy Green Show on the Chorus Radio Network.
I want to tell you there's a really good reason why I can't.
You can follow me on Twitter at The Roy Green Show, and you can tweet me, and I'll read your tweets. Email is roy@roygreenshow.com. I just tweeted the fundamentals of the story that Ed Burlew, criminal lawyer who handles many of the most highly profiled criminal charges laid against people in this country, gun owners, and many of the stories you're familiar with. Ed telling us about the 82-year-old Toronto man whose wife called 911 because her husband was suffering micro heart attacks, asked for an ambulance. This is an 82-year-old gun owner who had all his guns legally and safely stored. And his wife told the 911 operator that her husband sometimes said life wasn't worth living. And the operator, as you heard, Ed tell us, and the police put things together and said, I guess, well, we better take the SWAT teams over because he's got guns and he says life isn't worth living. And he found himself face to gun barrel with the emergency task force officers. Ed, what was the next story you were going to share with us?
Well, there was a gentleman, and this is maybe about 8 or 10 years ago. He couldn't work because of a disability, and he couldn't get his disability payments, and he was feeling sort of down. So he was seeing a counselor about that. His doctor had recommended it. He was seeing a psychiatrist, actually. And he was still a shooter. He was a hunter. And he had borrowed money off of his father-in-law to get by. He owed his father-in-law about $18,000. And then one day he goes to the mail, and he opens the mail, and they said, Here, you have won your appeal for disability. We're going to give you $30,000 now, and you're on disability. He called up his psychiatrist and said, I'm not coming in today. He got the receptionist and said, I'm not coming in today. Now, the psychiatrist didn't call him back and say, Harry, why? Harry would have said, I'm happy today. All my depression's gone. I can pay off my father-in-law, and I can survive. No, the psychiatrist called the police and said, Harry was going to kill himself. He didn't come in today. And the SWAT team went out. And they took his guns, and they took Harry. And they took Harry to the hospital under the Mental Health Act. 4 hours later, he was released from the hospital because the psychiatrist said, you're fine. You're not suicidal. That was the earliest they could see him. And the psychiatrist who'd called this in had to apologize and tell the police he was wrong. But in the meantime, a SWAT team of 4 officers had come to his house in the GTA to take him into custody.
So a good day turned into a pretty disastrous day immediately. How often does this happen, Ed? How often do these situations occur in this country?
Well, I think they must occur quite often. I get a call like this about every 6 to 8 weeks. And I've been consistently getting these calls for about 18, 19 years.
So is the objective then to persuade people who own guns legally in Canada, and remember this conversation all began this week because of the cruel abuse of firearms in the United States in murders. Is the objective in this country to persuade gun owners to give up their guns? It's to make you feel like it's not worth it. I don't need the potential trouble. I'll just give them up. Is that the objective?
It seems to be because, you can't even joke about things. If you make a joke that's a little dark, maybe a little bit off color, somebody's going to tell the cops, and then and they'll exaggerate it. And the cops then will run it up higher. A typical example, it wasn't a joke, but it's a farmer. A farmer had 200 acres. He was renting the property. It was the family farm, but his mother had sold it, and he had a 10-year lease on the farm, and he had beef cattle. So he said to mother, I'm not going to take your handouts anymore. I'm going to give you back your car. I'm going to stand on my own. He was 45 years old and divorced, living in the house. So he goes over to his mother's house, drops off the car, leaves, knocks on the door, gives the keys through the door slot. He then gets his gun out of the car. It's a little 22-lever action Winchester. He's had it all of his life, and he's already killed over 100 groundhogs that year on his 200-acre farm, because you can't have groundhogs digging holes and have cattle. They break their legs, and then you lose the cattle. So he walked home, and he walked through a construction site about 1,000 feet to the edge of his farm. Somebody there said, I saw a man with a gun walking on the road. Now this worker called into the police. And then the police came by, and they found that, the only house nearby was where his mother was. And they went to his mother, and they said, my God, your son, he's walking with a gun. What's he doing? Well, I don't know. What did he tell you? He says, I'm not going to see you again. And he went back home. Well, all of a sudden, now the police think we have a suicidal man.
Right.
He walked back home. With his gun, he didn't shoot any groundhogs. He didn't see him. He walked about 150 acres of his property, and he put the gun in a locked safe in his garage, detached from his house.
Right.
He went in. He made a coffee. While the coffee was brewing, he took the garbage out to the end of the road. He came back. He he went outside with his coffee now.
Ed, can you tell me this in 20 seconds?
And he was arrested by 4 SWAT teams.
All right. So the question that I have to ask is it worth hanging on to your firearms, knowing what you've just shared with us?
Oh, absolutely.
Ed, I thank you, as always, for your time. I'm going to turn it over to callers. Thank you, Ed.
Bye.
Ed Burlew, a criminal lawyer in Toronto. All right, I want to turn it over to you. You just heard these stories. I had no idea. None, zero. But clearly, the objective is for people not to, law doesn't want you to have a gun. 1-888-225-8255. I'm going to turn this over to gun owners. 1-888-225-8255 is my number. Based on what you heard, is it time for you to give up your firearms? The state doesn't want you to have them. And there's also societal concern about owning a gun. Based on what you heard, are you prepared to give up your guns or your gun? Just go to the police station and give it up. Is it time for you to do that? Or would you say absolutely not? 1-888-225-8255. 1-888-225-8255. Gun owner, call me.
News doesn't stop happening on Fridays. With News Talk Radio at its weekend best, The Roy Green Show delivers on the Chorus Radio Network.
You know, the situation in Virginia, with the shooting of the television station employees, and the shooting of the police officer in Texas, even though it's in the United States, it does get people asking questions about who should be allowed to own firearms. And then it does get people asking, should anybody be allowed to own firearms? So that's why I wanted to talk to Ed Burlew. There was one other question I wanted to ask Ed, and I forgot to ask, and he's gone now. But I didn't know about the situations that he explained to us, that he shared with us, about how quickly you can find yourself facing a SWAT team. But I'm wondering how many people who own firearms are getting to the point where they're thinking, maybe it's time I just gave these things up. Maybe it's just worth not worth holding on to them. If there's this societal frowning on gun ownership, and there's this interest by police and crown attorneys in people who own guns legally. Maybe it's gotten to the point where people are saying, I'm just going to go to the police station and turn them in, or I'm going to go to a gun shop and sell them. Are you at that point if you're a gun owner? Are you getting there? Do you think you might, based on what you've heard and what's been going on? 1-888-225-8255. Doug is on Highway 401 near Kingston, Ontario. Hey, Doug.
Hi, Roy. How are you?
I'm all right, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. My comment is that I'm strongly in favor of responsible gun ownership. I'm also in favor of the amnesty programs and turning guns in if they're no longer used for hunting or there are no more uses.
I don't understand why we don't have a consistent and always in place amnesty program where any time somebody who has a firearm wants to turn it in, and if it hasn't been used in the commission of a crime, and I suppose in amnesty programs you can turn, even if they have been used in the commission of some crimes, you can turn them in and not be charged. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that if you contact the police properly and on this type of thing that they have any problem with you, or they'll come to your house and receive a firearm. They'll do some checking, of course, because the police aren't stupid. Now, in terms of this lawyer, Ed, whatever his last name is.
Burlew.
Yeah, I was a policeman for 35 years. I've never heard a lawyer that has any substance continually, especially in a public forum, referring to the police as cops. Also, I've never heard any stories more exaggerated and slanted to suit his particular perspective. I can tell you honestly, especially in the first instance, if somebody contacted the police about this 90-year-old that was called the ambulance, and the police said, yeah, we did it, that did not happen. The police would not give that kind of an explanation.
Well, Mr. Burlew, I have to tell you, Doug, Mr. Burlew has handled some of the most high-profile gun cases in this country.
Yeah, how many has he won?
Well, I got quite a few. He handled the
really?
case. He handled the case for Ian Thompson in southwestern Ontario. You may remember that story, where he's had trouble with his neighbors, and there was a firebombing assault on his home, and people were out shouting death threats. Ian Thompson, small arms firearms instructor, and he fired warning shots over the heads of these guys, and he was criminally charged. That was one of Ed Burlew's cases.
Yeah.
But here, I mean, I did some, Doug, I did some checking, and I was told by somebody who's in the firearms business, as it were, that if a 911 call is made for an emergent case, and if the person in the home has firearms, and the wrong thing is said, like what he said about, I may not have real interest in living much longer, or worse to that effect, that you will face the police before you face the paramedics. I was told that. Not just by Mr. Burlew.
Yeah, okay. I completely agree that the wrong thing can lead to a kind of a reaction. There is no doubt about it. Now, the problem being is if the police do not react properly, or they start going, well, maybe it's serious and maybe it isn't, and a policeman goes over there and he gets shot because he didn't, take the proper precautions. I wonder how.
But is it proper precautions to have special weapons and tactics teams facing an 82-year-old man sitting in his chair with his guns locked away?
Well, providing the 82-year-old man isn't sitting there with his gun waiting for the policeman to come through the door.
He wasn't.
Well, how do they know that?
Well, they know it when they get there. Oh, why not let the paramedics in? Why not go in with the paramedic? I mean, there's so many questions that require answers. It's like the New Brunswick man, the 68-year-old New Brunswick resident who was the victim of a home invasion. And he used a rifle and he shot one of the home invaders in the leg. Now he today is charged criminally, Doug, and he could face more prison time than the individuals who invaded his home and threatened his life. He was being beaten, allegedly, when he fired the shot.
Well, I didn't say that was, I didn't make the laws. I'm just saying that there is a way of enforcing the laws, and the police are trying to enforce the laws in a fair and equitable way, but they also have to do it in a way that protects them so that they don't make any mistakes that's going to cost them their lives.
Yeah, I understand.
And this type of thing. We're dealing with guns here. And the only people that really are responsible, I'd like to think, with firearms in the public are the police.
Are we in a time in our societies, and I'm looking at the cases that happened in the United States this week, which got the huge international headlines as they deserved and a lot of discussion as they deserved, and they continue to deserve. Are we at a time in our society where it is time for people who own firearms legally to think about turning them over? Is there a thinking among police and crown attorneys and the justice system that there is no need for people to own firearms? What do you say?
Well, I think that they should turn them over, but to compare our society to the U.S. society is.
No, I'm not making a comparison.
Really.
I'm not making a comparison. I'm saying that there is seems to be a societal, certainly a judicial and governmental frowning on owning firearms. We saw that in High River in Alberta.
Absolutely. I think that, firearms for hunting, this type of thing, is certainly a legitimate use. I certainly hope that we don't have to arm ourselves in our
No. What I'm asking is, based on what's been talked about, based on the issue of firearms, which has been front and center again this week in the United States, but in Canada and the rest of the world because of what happened in the United States, is it time for people to turn in firearms? Period.
Absolutely.
That's where you're going to get the pushback from the gun owners.
Well, of course you can push back from gun owners.
But that's the way. Do you think then, final question for you, do you think that a majority of police officers in this country, and I don't know how many of them own firearms themselves, apart from their issued weapons, do you think a majority of police officers would be in favor of no one owning a firearm?
I would think so.
Okay. Doug, I thank you for the call, sir.
Sure.
Thank you. There was another question I wanted to ask Mr. Burlew, and I just forgot. But I'll get him back on the show. But I've heard, I talked to one other person particularly, who said that if you, for example, if you were to use the word, no, I won't go there. I won't go there. I don't want to do that. I want to check out this one story I was going to mention. I'll check it out in detail, and then I will get back to you, and if the story does completely check out, I'll share it with you. And if it does check out, you will be shocked.